Please join me in welcoming Ms. Aarti Tikoo Singh. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to start with a famous Walter Cronkite quote. He once said, "I think being a liberal in the true sense is being non-doctrinaire, non-dogmatic, non-committed to a cause, but examining each case on its merits. Being left of center is another thing. It's a political position. I think most newspaper men, by definition, have to be liberal. If they're not liberal by my definition of it, then they can hardly be good newspaper men. If they are preordained dogmatists for a cause, then they can't be very good journalists. That is, if they carry it into their journalism." I often weigh my work in Cronkite's parameters, in his way of looking at journalism, the responsibility journalists are supposed to share in society. And I can confidently claim that I not only qualify his parameters, but I pass with flying colors because I have been reporting truth from Kashmir objectively. And I am here in the US as a journalist. I appeared before the Congress as a witness to what I had experienced in Kashmir in the last, not just last few months, but last 2 decades as a journalist. And I feel that my primary responsibility here is to speak to my own fellow journalists, to speak to my own fraternity about how the reality of Kashmir has been distorted by a certain partisan, dogmatic way of reporting truth. And that's why I was mentioning Cronkite, because Cronkite gives you the moral compass to report facts and truth from the ground. When you report from the left or the right dogmatic way or prism of ideology, you end up reporting falsehoods, and that's what has happened in Kashmir and on Kashmir in the last few months. I was there on August 5th when the government of India decided to revoke special status of Kashmir. Not just Kashmir, but Jammu and Kashmir state. And that's where the first problem arises, when the most of the Western media or even sections of Indian media try to project an entire state as a small part of this big, diverse, ethnically, religiously, and socially different regions of the state as a small Muslim-dominated part of the state, which is Kashmir Valley. Therefore, my biggest beef with my own fraternity is that they lack a certain context, they lack a certain understanding, and lack nuance about what they are reporting from the ground. They completely are oblivious to the fact that, to begin with, the lockdown that was imposed by the government on August 5th because of the anticipation of terror attacks, anticipation of violence on the streets, they went out projecting that lockdown as a means of oppression. Whereas the fact is, when you compare all the previous lockdowns that Kashmir has witnessed, in fact in 2016 when the entire valley was shut down for almost 6 months, it was a shutdown imposed by militants. It was a shutdown imposed by Pakistan-backed terror groups. It was a lockdown imposed by the separatists who not only support Pakistan but have varied thinking, including the idea of Islamic Caliphate, which is represented by ISIS in Middle East. So the lockdown this time, of course, it was started by the government, but after 2 weeks, the lockdown completely was overtaken by the militants. It was the Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, and Lashkar-e-Taiba terror groups who issued posters about Muslims, asking Muslims to refrain from resuming normal activity. It were these groups who went out and killed a 65-year-old Muslim, a Kashmiri Muslim shopkeeper, because he defied the militant diktat and opened his shop. It were these terror groups who went out and shot at 4 members of a family who wanted to sell apples in this lockdown situation imposed by the militants. So when you report that all of this lockdown is actually imposed by the government of India, you're doing a disservice not to India, you're doing a disservice to your own profession, you're doing a disservice to your own ethics as a journalist. The other thing that I noticed in the Western press was there was a headline, I think, which said that Kashmir is almost facing a genocidal, kind of a situation because of lack of healthcare. And the truth is, healthcare in Kashmir, through the last 30 years of Islamic terror, has figured out a way to deal with such exigencies. They have figured out that there will be long stretches of shutdowns. So I went to all the hospitals in Kashmir. I went to 3 major hospitals. That also reminds me, Brad Sherman, who was the chairman at the congressional hearing of that subcommittee, he did not even know where Srinagar is. He had, he was confused to the extent that he had to ask me. And yet he went on to hold a committee, a trial on only Kashmir human rights violations. That said, my point here is that when I went to these hospitals and spoke to the hospital practitioners, spoke to the medical authorities, I spoke to patients and their attendees, I got to know that healthcare was functioning smoothly. And you have to remind yourself that this healthcare is being run by Kashmiri Muslims themselves. This is being run by the civilians themselves. And the patients invariably told me that yes, they had some difficulty reaching to the hospital because there were no mobile phones to call an ambulance, but they were able to manage private transportation, and they were able to reach the hospitals where they were treated well and treated as efficiently as before. So when you go out and present an optic to the world that India is killing people by not giving them access to healthcare, you again are betraying your profession. You're betraying your ethics and objectivity. The other thing that I noticed in the Western press was, besides healthcare and besides the fact that this is a lockdown imposed by militants, which is still carrying on, did not report the fact that shops and markets in Kashmir are opening from early morning to late morning. They are opening from late evening to almost late night. So that nobody has even tried to figure out why that is happening. Who is really behind this? Who is orchestrating this? Why are shopkeepers doing this? I'm going to quote an instance where I spoke to people about why markets were shut, why they were opening them in the morning and why they were opening them in the evening. And people sitting there, of course, said they are unhappy, they are dejected, and they are disillusioned, and they're angry at what the government of India had done. And it would be, again, unethical if you do not report this fact. Yes, Kashmiri Muslim civilians are unhappy about what the government did. They are not happy with the revocation of special status of Jammu and Kashmir. But I will get to the other point in this context, that only Kashmir Valley is unhappy, dejected, disillusioned, and has a sense of defeat. It's not widespread in the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, and earlier Ladakh as well. So these people told me that they are angry because the government did not even consult them. And that, I think, is a fair point, because in a democracy you expect consultations, you expect people, the government, to ask you what their view is on such a major decision. And while I was talking to them, an entire mob gathered. The mob started shouting slogans of La ilaha illallah, Pakistan se rishta kya, blah blah blah. And people said, ma'am, these people are lying to you. This has nothing to do with 370 or 35A. And I was like, why? They are saying that they are angry and that's why they have shut their shops. And they said, no, this has, all the protests that have been happening are about separation from India. They are about, we want to separate from Hindu India. We are Muslims. We care about our Muslim Islamic identity. And that is the truth, and we will defeat India, we will break India into pieces, but we will get our Azadi. And that brings me to the point that if you have noticed, all the protests that happened in Kashmir were concentrated in a certain area. They were not widespread as they were in 2016, for example, from north to south and center. We have had, massive violence in 2016 when Burhan Bani, the Hizbul Mujahideen commander, was killed, and we have had 80 to 90 youth killed in the clashes with security forces in 2016. But this time there was no violence of, not the scale, but there was no violence, period, from clashes between security forces and the youth protesting out there on the streets. So what was the violence about? Where were the protests? The protests were located in a small area of Srinagar, the summer capital of Jammu and Kashmir. And in that area, they have cut out, they have in fact blockaded themselves, they have dug the roads, they have, if you have to enter that area, you have to enter that area with their permission. It's a small area, it's around, I would say, 15 to 20,000 people. And I think in the future, it is going to be a major challenge for Indian security forces. In those protests that, that happened, I think, soon after the decision was made, people were raising flags of Jaish-e-Mohammed. People were raising flags of Hizbul Mujahideen. People were raising flags of Pakistan and Islam. There were no flags of Jammu and Kashmir state. Jammu and Kashmir state, you have to remember, used to have its own flag. There were no people waving the copies of Jammu and Kashmir constitution, which people are actually now worried about and saying that government shouldn't have revoked our status. There were no people who were carrying copies of Indian constitution, which had 370, which still has Article 370 and Article 35A. If these protests were about 370 and 35A, people would have been asking for, restoration of the Indian Constitution. But you have to remind yourself that these people who are protesting out there never saw the legitimacy of one instrument of accession with India, never recognized the Constitution of India, they never recognized the Jammu and Kashmir Constitution as well. So when you conflate all these realities as Kashmir in protest against India and against India's oppression and so-called occupation, you are peddling myths. You're peddling fake news. You're not doing service to your profession. You are betraying the profession, the ethic of journalism that we were supposed to uphold. So, political, social, and economic, three different areas where I think government of India is concerned about at the moment. And I believe that the larger section of Jammu and Kashmir, especially Kashmir, is fundamentally looking at constitutional mechanisms to address their concerns. The larger section of Kashmiri society has been peaceful throughout these 3 months. You have to recognize that. If you don't recognize that, you will again be doing a disservice to your profession. They have been looking at constitutional means to address what has happened. They went to the court. They went to the Supreme Court of India. What does that indicate? It indicates that they have faith in the institutions of India, that they went to the apex court of India where they think they can pressure the government to reverse their decision. We don't know how the Supreme Court will decide on the issue, but the fact that people are looking also at negotiations with the government in New Delhi and also in Srinagar by hoping that the government might give them domicile rights to protect their land and their jobs. Now let me also mention here that Article 370, which people have been talking about here as well as back home, was diluted not just by this government, but diluted by successive governments throughout since 1952, when Delhi and Kashmir got into an agreement, which is famously known as Delhi Agreement. So there has been an erosion of Article 370, and it was India's first Prime Minister Nehru who himself said that eventually 370 will go, it has to go. If that is the case, then often people say, I heard a lot of people saying here in the US that there is a Hindutva project. Well, you have to then say that Nehru was also Hindutva. Nehru, the entire Congress was Hindutva, because they started the erosion of Article 370. The only teeth that Article 370 was left with is Article 35A, which is about protecting the land and jobs and other voting rights of Jammu and Kashmir people. But Article 35A, unfortunately, was also perpetuating gender discrimination, xenophobia, and other illiberal attitudes in Jammu and Kashmir. 35A was in a way giving a go-ahead to a section in the Jammu and Kashmir constitution which pertains to the permanent residency. I, as a woman who's married to a non-state subject, according to that law, until 2002, I immediately became invalid as a state subject because the law itself was gender discriminatory. It didn't see an outsider as a resident, even if that outsider was married to a woman of the state. The same was not necessarily true for men. Men could marry anyone from outside the state, and their wives could immediately become the state subjects. But in 2002, fortunately, High Court of Jammu and Kashmir revoked this whole gender discriminatory clause in the law and made it gender neutral, but only to a certain extent. So I'm quite amazed that my co-panelists who were there at the congressional hearing, they lied on oath that it wasn't gender discriminatory. It is gender discriminatory simply because after the 2002 High Court judgment, I still am unable to pass on my inheritance to my children because I'm married to a non-state subject. Any woman who is not married to a state subject cannot pass her inheritance, and her children cannot have any rights in Jammu and Kashmir as a citizen. So the whole article was gender discriminatory. Not only that, it was also against Dalits. If we as a liberal society, if we as a liberal fraternity That's why I mentioned Walter Cronkite, because we are fundamentally supposed to be liberal, we are supposed to be open, we are supposed to uphold the values of equality. How then do you go out and say that this was gender neutral and it was everything about Jammu and Kashmir, not Jammu and Kashmir, and everything about Kashmir is great and wonderful and liberal and secular? Whereas the fact is, Kashmir lost its secularism and pluralism in 1989-90 itself. The demographics of Kashmir was changed in 1990 itself, when an entire community, minority community of Hindus, Kashmiri Hindus, were ethnically cleansed, they were driven out, they were targeted. Over 700 Kashmiri Pandits were killed in 89 and through early 90s. And the audacity of some of the panelists to say that this is a secular movement for Azadi or independence is again a blatant lie. If your conscience is not awake to the fact that an entire minority community was ethnically cleansed and you did not raise your voice against it, you did not even write any of the columns space that you have given to the lockdown, the inconvenience that people have suffered in last 3 months, well, please go and look at your ethics of journalism once again. That would be my suggestion. The other fact, the Western refugees, the West Pakistan refugees, for example, who migrated to Jammu and Kashmir in 1947, they still do not, until this decision happened, they still did not have the rights as citizens of that state. Why? Because we had these permanent residency laws. So for anyone to claim that permanent residency was a protection of liberal ideas and it was upholding liberal principles is again telling a lie. I think I've said enough, and I'm sure you probably have questions about various things, but I will end on one note. I am here as a journalist speaking to my fraternity with a request. Please know that it is the killers of Daniel Pearl, who was one among us, who was one of us who had been to Pakistan. It were his killers who beheaded him, who slaughtered him. It is his killers who are imposing the lockdown in Kashmir today. It is his killers who have destroyed Kashmir, who have destroyed Kashmir's syncretic culture. It is his killers who are still holding Kashmir Valley to ransom. It is his killers who have killed that 65-year-old shopkeeper and that 5-year-old girl who was trying to sell apples. So to negate all of that, to negate the context and the nuance of history, I'm sorry, this will be a disservice to your own profession and ethics. Thank you.